Welcome to the first ever Global Brain Trust event, which is pretty exciting. It's been quite a long time coming. People have requested it for a while, so here we are in the virtual environment. So I'm going to be bringing on our first presenter, Tony Macknight, soon. And he's going to be giving his many years of experience in education, and he's one to watch. For those of you who don't know, Tony's one of the founders of ADInstruments, and he was a professor here at Otago for many years in medical school of physiology. So Tony, I'm going to be bringing you on now. And yes, so once Tony kicks off, I'll stop sharing my screen, and all things going smoothly, Tony should be coming on, and here we go. Just as easy as that. Hi, Tony. So I'll hand over to you to kick us off.
Okay, thanks, Liam. I shall now hopefully share my screen with you. Just wait one moment. Well, what I'm going to do today is to talk about my views on how you can future-proof your teaching. And of course, this is very important at the moment because, as these pictures show you, we are living in a very strange time indeed. Intriguing time, really, but one that certainly has got its own challenges. So, you know the consequences of the COVID-19 better than I do, but these are some of the consequences, and I'm sure you can think of others. But the fact is that now we are much more needing to do remote teaching than we ever did before. And the result of this disruption is this enforced move to online teaching. And again, you can fill in some of these things. There's obviously consequences for the universities, consequences for teachers, and consequences for students. But there are also opportunities. And to me, the really exciting thing is the opportunity we now have to rethink what, how, and why we teach. What we hope to achieve, how we can begin to achieve this, and what is the most important factor in student learning. And I'm going to answer that question in just a moment. But when you go through the university's mission statements, etc., they're all telling us that they want their students to be lifelong learners, to apply information. And if we're really going to be able to do that, we can only really achieve that through active learning. And so I'm going to be emphasizing here active learning. And I'm going to tell you what I think are what I call the 4 E's of learning. And learning for the student should be effective. It should be efficient, which means that the student should not spend unnecessary time on tasks that they don't believe are benefiting them. The learning should be everlasting, it should be lifelong, and it should be exciting, because if it isn't exciting, the students aren't going to learn it. Now, I would apply exactly those same statements to the instructors. For the instructors have to feel what they're doing is effective. The instructors also have to use their time efficiently. The instructors also need to believe that what they're teaching is going to be learnt forever, not just to pass an exam. And the instructors have to feel excited by what they're doing. So these underpin of what we do, and I think we should measure what we do against those 4 criteria. Are we being effective, efficient? Is the learning everlasting? And are the students finding it exciting? Now, above all else, it's really essential you teach your course, not someone else's course, because nothing is going to work unless you believe in what you're doing. And in particular, the students believe that you believe in what you are doing. And of course, as I've said, we have to learn efficiently. The time and effort and commitment that the students put in has to be seen to be rewarded. And nothing else is more important than teachers. the instructor. You are the key to all of learning, and we cannot do without you. We should never diminish your role, and whether we're teaching online or face-to-face, you are at the center of your students' learning. And we must keep you there, and we must emphasize that, and we mustn't let anyone else ever say, oh, well, we don't need teachers, we can put it all online. Nothing could be further from the truth than that. So if you think about nothing else, think of how important you are to the teaching. Now, you can recognize 4 components of physiology courses. These are they. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, thinking about how we might change it, how we might use it, and how we can future-proof our teaching through modifying or changing what we do in these. But before I do that, just a quick word about what ADInstruments can offer you to make your task easier. And we have 3 components, you can say, that we can offer you in physiology. There's Understand Your Physiology, the recently released active learning resource. And this was developed with an advisory panel, and you're going to hear from all of those people in the next 3 days. And it was designed specifically for instructors to use and modify in blended learning courses. So it's actually designed specifically for the task that you now face. And you can see there's a summary there. There's over 3,900 individual questions, over 2,200 illustrations. They cover the topics that any physiology course will cover, which is summarized there. And by the end of the year, there will be analytics built into that so that you'll be able to follow your students' progress when they use it. Now, it is not intended to just be given to the students to use. It's intended to be given to you to change, to modify, to employ whatever you want within your own course. But a lot of stuff is there that you can use. We also have our human physiology collection of laboratories, and those are particularly relevant now because every experiment within each laboratory has example data associated with it, so that if you can't do the actual experiments, the students can still online see how the experiments are performed and examine and make measurements on the data. So they can do a lot of the laboratory even if they cannot attend the laboratory in person. And then we also have a very important and unique collection of patient case studies, which contain video clips of the patients, clips of health professionals, full case histories, results and investigations that you can incorporate into your teaching to make your teaching more relevant and exciting to your students. So those are the resources that we can offer, and I will illustrate some of those resources as we go through, but those resources are all available to you. So let's start with lectures. Now, what happened before the virus is that we got up and we talked to the students. Some people would say we talked at the students. But in many universities, including my universities, all of these were videotaped. And the consequence was actually that the students didn't come to the lectures anyway. They watched the videos, and the staff were complaining that only about 20% of the class were attending the lectures. So videoing the lectures has actually removed a significant part of the face-to-face element from those lectures anyway. Now, the first thing that most people did when we went into these lockdowns and distance teaching was video their lectures. So you've got videoed lectures. And in the future, to future-proof your course, whatever you now use for lectures, and we'll come to that, will be, I believe, have videoed components within them. So now I want you to read this. Since we're going to rethink what we do with lectures, are lectures as presently given effective? And this very interesting article by Mutterschack who is a very experienced educator, I think is very relevant. So I'll just give you a moment to read that through and then we can go on. Well, I hope that most of you have had the opportunity now to read that and you've enjoyed it. And as I read it again, I think to myself how true all this is and how for so many years I was standing up there telling people facts. They were writing them down, regurgitating them for the exam and never really understanding and acquiring the knowledge that I had hoped they'd acquired when I gave the lecture. So I think we'd probably all agree that lectures as described in that description just don't work very well anyway. So it's not going to be a great loss to give them up. So we don't need lectures any longer to convey facts. But lectures, or at least your appearance to the students, is really important. You can inspire the students, you can explain concepts, and you provide a framework for learning. And we can also, within that lecture material, provide inspirational videos from our patient library, which will show students why they're learning a major topic. And I'll illustrate this very briefly with how I would introduce a respiratory physiology course. Here's our patient, and you can just hear a little bit of what she has to say.
My breathlessness has gradually got worse. Perhaps over the last 2 years, it's got worse. I'm okay when I'm in bed. It doesn't seem to affect me, but as soon as I put my feet to the floor, that's when I find that not so good. I can't walk very far, and just everyday things. It just seems to block everything.
So you get the idea. So we can basically say to students, after they've seen that, we can simply say to them, okay, this is why we teach respiratory physiology, because you need to understand why that person is breathless, how it affects their life, and what we can do about it. And you don't have to have any more reason if you're teaching health science students than that. So the videos of patients can be very important in providing an inspiration for students learning. Now let's go back to how we can make this lecture time more effective. And I'm going to start with what you shouldn't do. And absolutely don't video the lectures you currently give and put them on your LMS and give the students access to them, because it's a waste of everybody's time. You know, the one thing we don't want to encourage is passive learning. If you do that, you're absolutely encouraging passive learning, because you know what the students will do. They will go and play that lecture enough times while they sleep through it that somehow they've absorbed it and hopefully they can regurgitate what you told them. But they won't really have thought about it. They won't have actively engaged in it. They won't have learned. And here's a little comment from an article I came across recently in Nature. 5 tips for moving teaching online as COVID-19 takes hold. And they make this point: don't convert your entire lecture to videos. Identify a few specific things that you want students to learn, focus on these. And the other thing I would strongly urge you to do is don't use someone else's videos, because the students actually want and they need to see and hear you. They need to feel that their teacher is engaged with them, not someone else being engaged with them. I had a long think when I developed Understand Your Physiology, because initially I thought, we'll put some short videos in these and we can get those made and we'll have some video explanations. And then I decided against that, because the students can see videos anyway. There's YouTube's full of them, but they can't see you. And you cannot substitute another teacher for you in your course. And I learned this very clearly when students that we were teaching, we made some videos of a physical examination of patients done by the students' own teachers. And the overwhelming feedback from our medical students was, thank goodness we're seeing our teachers do things. It makes all the difference for us. So this is a really important message to you. Make sure you feature. It's your voice, it's your image that you see in the videos that you make and not someone else's. Now, how do you make your lectures more effective? Well, design each lecture around selected key concepts and then introduce each concept by 1 or 2 simple questions before the students see your short, which should be less than 5 minutes, video. And this, I think, is also a very interesting point, which I'll leave you to read now, about failing productively. So I think this idea that before you tell the students something, they retrieve what they know about it is enormously important. And so I believe that what you should do when you construct a lecture, in inverted commas now, is design it around some selected key concepts and get the students to think about the concept before they hear you talk about it and before they then answer questions to test whether they've understood the concept. So each concept is introduced by a question, is discussed by you in a very brief video, and then is followed up by questions testing the understanding the students have of the concept. So let me show you an example of how this could work. Let's imagine that the topic is electrical activity of the heart. And your concept that you want to get across to them is that the electrical activity results in a coordinated contraction of cardiac muscle. So before you show them anything, ask them a simple question. And the question should be very simple. It should be something they can all answer so that they feel confident as they go into watch your video that they're going to be able to understand and learn from what you're telling them. So here's their simple question, very easy, and they can type some answer in there. It doesn't matter what they type in because you're not going to look at it, but they've had the opportunity to think about it. And then you show them a video. In this case, it's an animation of the electrical activity. Now, I would, if I was doing this, I would have a voiceover describing it, and I would break that down into images at showing the different components. So I'd have an image starting here and then etc. And that would take 2 or 3 minutes just to go through that briefly and say, this is what happens with the electrical activity of the heart. Now they've watched that, you then, after the video clip, have these questions for them to answer. Now, this frees you up from telling them a lot of factual material, because they're going to get the factual material as they answer these questions. Drag and drop image labeling, and then some questions about the different parts of the sinoatrial node, the AV node, the bundles, and the Purkinje fibers. And then some questions to drag and drop to test their understanding. And as they do this with all of these, they get immediate feedback. So creating an online lesson in LT, which involves these components, a pre-question, your video embedded in this LT presentation, and then the questions after, is now their lecture. And it can be all online, it's all done, and you basically don't any longer use the conventional lecture time for face-to-face teaching. You do all that now in these, in inverted commas, online lectures. Now, what that does is free up any face-to-face time you have, if it's a blended learning course, for tutorials. And if you can't have face-to-face teaching, the tutorials also become an online activity. So let's move now to tutorials. They follow the lectures and they build upon the concepts. Now, in preparing for tutorials, we know what doesn't work. We know perfectly well, because I did it for years and it didn't work. Tell them to read chapter X in the textbook. Read this exciting new paper, that's even less effective. Asking them to read it all is actually very difficult. Let's just ask ourselves now why this reading of textbooks doesn't work. And here is Andy Mutterschack again commenting on that, and I'll leave you to read it. Now, I'm actually an avid textbook reader, and I've always enjoyed reading textbooks. But I do know what is meant there. And I do also know, talking to you all over the years, that you're all finding that the students aren't reading any longer anyway. So I think the idea of getting students to prepare for tutorials by reading textbooks is probably no longer an effective strategy, if it ever was. So what can we do instead? So prior to their actual, hopefully face-to-face session, or a Zoom type session if they can't be face-to-face, create a collection of questions for the students to work through in their own time. And these should provide a range of question types, provide instant quality feedback for all the questions, provide repetitive material for rehearsal. You should encourage the students to collaborate where they can, and also you should use analytics so you can check the students' progress on the material, and the students should know you're doing this and why you're doing this. You're doing it to make sure that they're being successful, because you really need, as we're going to discuss, to know how your students are doing week by week in any course which is future-proofed. And then when you run your tutorials, hopefully on campus, you have what, for terminology I don't particularly like, but flipped classroom. You've already freed up this time that used to be used for lectures. Now you can give the students problem work and discussion time within that lecture format and within that lecture time. If the student numbers are large, get them working in groups so that you are working with groups, not with individuals. If you've got 120 students, for instance, if you have groups of 6, you're working with 20 groups, not 120 students. And if you're having to do this with distant teaching, again, encourage the students to form groups and find ways they can discuss questions prior to their online Zoom or other meeting. And I'm going to be really interested in the next 4 days to find out how you people are doing these things. I haven't myself done these things. I know there's a lot of ideas out there. And one of the great things about this 4 days is going to be learning from you about how you're doing them. Now, if you're doing the analytics, you will be able to find out what questions are giving the students problems, and you'll be able to encourage students to discuss those before you meet with them. And you'll also have learnt what students are having problems with and provide additional questions for the groups when they do meet that will extend their learning. So now, what about laboratories? Well, traditionally, we have laboratories as an essential component of physiology courses. And now I'm going to discuss some of those issues related to laboratories. The first thing that I'm not going to spend time on is whether people should be doing human or animal laboratories. In introductory physiology courses, because of cost and ethical conditions, overwhelmingly now we are moving to human experiments because they are easily now done with modern transducers and electronics. And we can cover virtually everything that used to be done with animal experiments with human experiments instead. So I don't want to spend more time on it. I'm going to assume you're doing human laboratories. So why do we have physiology labs for students? And the only legitimate answer is that they will learn from the labs what they can't learn elsewhere. This is a question of learning efficiency. If I can efficiently learn something without spending 2 hours in a lab, why wouldn't I learn it outside of the lab? So we have to identify what it is that they can learn in labs that they can't learn efficiently anywhere else. And the top of this with human labs is their own physiology. Students absolutely love recording their own physiological variables, their ECGs, their respiratory function, their autonomic responses. These bring the physiology to life for them, and they alone justify the in-person, face-to-face human physiology laboratories. There's a whole lot of other things students learn. You can read through this: biological variability, how difficult it is to make measurements. We can illustrate basic physiological principles. Students can do some data analysis. They can do simple statistical analysis. And if you design the experiments appropriately, you can introduce scientific method and experimental design. Many laboratories at student first year level don't do that, and the laboratories we routinely provide don't do that particularly. But you can use LT and you can do that. And in many places, I think you should do that. Now let's just compare the outcomes from doing the live laboratory, doing the online laboratory, or as some people now do, rather than doing any real laboratories, have laboratory simulations. Now, these are my ratings of those 3 experiences. Obviously, only live laboratories give students their own physiology. Biological variability is equally well demonstrated either doing the experiments yourselves or looking at the data that's been recorded. You can illustrate basic principles those ways best. Simulations can illustrate them to some degree, but I don't think as well as the real data. Showing the difficulty of experiments is only really able to be done with the live laboratory. You can get an inkling of it from the type of data that you can see from those laboratories. Of course, the laboratory simulation gives you no indication at all of that. Data analysis is again best done on real data, not on simulated data. Statistical analysis can be done on any data. The scientific method, as we presently set things up, is not done particularly well on any of these three, but you can, by redesigning your live laboratories, really teach scientific method very, very well in live laboratories. The one thing you can do really well with simulations is to extend observations from what is possible at student level experiments. For example, if I want to teach the physiology of blood loss and illustrate that with data, I obviously can't get that from students. So I have to get either real live data recorded and put into LT or through simulated data. So there is a place for additional data and simulations to extend laboratory observations. But that is, for me, the only place where I would think there's a role for laboratory simulation. Now, one of the really interesting things you can do when you're teaching the health science students is when they do their experiments on themselves, you can have performed the same experiments on the patients, and we've done that. And so we provide you with the data the students were getting also measured on the patients, and the students can now do direct comparisons between the data they get, which would be this data, and the data on the patients. This particular example is heart rate variability, showing the variation beat to beat in heart rate for quiet breathing, the red dots, and deep breathing, the open blue circles. And you can see how variable even quiet breathing is, and how much more the variability increases when we breathe deeply. And you can see that for a person with, in this case, an autonomic peripheral neuropathy, they really can't change their heart rate, and there's no real relationship between the breathing and the variability in heart rate. And so that shows, in fact, a way of illustrating autonomic dysfunction. So it's really interesting that students can do this, because now they can see how the normal and the abnormal compare. And of course, normal is not abnormal, and abnormal is not normal. That's how we define the two. And you can see very closely, very clearly, that difference there. Now, I believe that the future laboratory for health science students particularly is not going to be what we presently do. We're now in a position where we are able to make cheaper, effective transducers, and we're going to release a set of these in the very near future, which, running with LT, will enable students to do much more simply the experiments they currently do, or many of the experiments they currently do. And why we've done this is because we want to be able to have the students do their laboratory, what we call now their laboratory work, while they're in their small groups discussing case-based, problem-based studies. So as they discuss a patient's problem, let's say there's an ECG problem, the students there and then, while discussing this, can measure their own ECGs. You take the laboratory work into the case-based discussion. As I say, take the laboratory to the students, not the students to the laboratory. It means you don't need to provide large laboratory spaces for the type of education the students are going to have in the future. So that is coming, and that's going to be a really important trend, particularly in nursing and medical education, where they may not even have the conventional laboratories that physiology departments have. Now, finally, the exam problem. This is what we hope, that we're going to teach, they're going to learn, and they're going to understand. But actually what happens is we put the examination in the road, and students feel they don't have time to really understand. They're just learning to pass the exam. And so exams short circuit understanding. And this is a major problem. How many times have students come up to you at the end of a lecture that you've given and they've said, is this going to be in the exam? And the implication is, if it isn't in the exam, I'm not going to learn it. Even though it may be a hugely important concept, which you might have difficulty testing in an exam. So this is my solution here. First of all, you are not going to change students' learning behaviors without aligning the way you assess their learning with the way you deliver the course. So if we're going to future-proof our teaching, we've got to make sure that the examinations of the future are in line with our future-proofed teaching. So when you plan changing the way you deliver your courses, start by deciding how you wish to assess the understanding. Now, LT and Understand Your Physiology can provide the platform and the material for you to alter the ways you assess student achievement. And I would really strongly urge, and I'm going to be fascinated to hear what you're all doing now, that we move away from the single major exam. Instead, we use analytics in LT to follow each individual student's study. So we know how they're getting on, we know where they're having problems, we know whether they're doing the work or not. And then we put in regular small tests. We use questions they've already used in their tutorial or in their so-called lectures. We choose only those that can be computer marked, because not every type of question can be computer marked, because we want to encourage the students that they're making progress with their learning, and we do not want to spend our time marking countless tests, because it's a waste of your instructor's time to be marking tests. You could be using that time much more constructively and helping students learn. Then you can build in interviews. So if students are having problems that you can detect through the analytics, have a talk with them, find out what their problem is, and devise with them personalized programs that will help them overcome those problems. And depending on the problem, there's a range of possibilities. And then one or two larger tests that utilize a mix of the questions they've already been doing and that effectively will test their understanding. Now, your universities are going to have policies about online examining, but honestly, I would put all of these online. I would say to students, okay, here's a test. You're going to have 2 hours to do it. It will start at 2 in the afternoon. It will finish at 4. Within those 2 hours, you do this. We don't care if you go and look up stuff in a book, if you go back and look at stuff, because we've put enough questions in here that if you find you have to do that a lot, if you don't really know this stuff, if you're trying desperately to learn it now for the first time, you're just not going to complete the test. You're not going to get the marks because you won't complete the test. You're going to have to know enough to be able to work efficiently through the test. You can construct tests like that. And we want to encourage, I mean, who in their right mind in the future is going to think, oh, I can't look this up. If I don't remember it, I'm going to have to kill the patient. This is nonsense. This idea that we're somehow giving students a whole lot of material that they'll use the rest of their lives without ever relearning or studying it again. It's just not the way that life is, and the real world doesn't function that way. So here's a summary of my future-proofed course. My lectures and tutorials are now completely online. They've been designed as I've described. My laboratories, hopefully, are actually real, but if they are online, then the students are able to do the important things. They're able to look at data, they're able to analyze it, and they're able to critique it. If they are available to come in, I incorporate the laboratories into the tutorial, face-to-face, flipped classroom, whatever time, and the laboratories become part of that learning experience built around understanding of the concepts at the time they're doing them. And then, as I've said, the course assessment is, as I've just summarized. And now you're free, because today I can teach online, tomorrow I go into lockdown. My course doesn't really change at all. Now, what I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all is how you are coping with all this. What are you doing? What tools you've developed with your necessary online teaching? I'm going to be absolutely fascinated, because the great thing about these brain trusts for me, why I love to be at them and why I wish I was meeting with all of you now rather than having to do this remotely, is because every person that I ever talk to, I learn something from. You teach me far more than I've ever taught you, and I really value you all, and you're the greatest resource that ADInstruments could ever have, and I really do enjoy these Brains Trust so much. So thanks, Liam, for organizing this, and thanks to you all for listening, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. I'm sure there'll be a lot of applause if people could be communicating back to you. So we've got 15 minutes for you to be answering some of the questions that have come through. So Tony, you should be able to see those questions in the Q&A feature down below. Some of them are quite long, so I might give you some time to read through before you answer.
Yeah, actually, this is great. I shall work my way through them as best I can. If I don't answer correctly, I'm reminded of the politician. We had a famous Prime Minister here who, after he became Prime Minister, still was involved in politics. And he once appeared on a television interview. And the interviewer said, was a young, enthusiastic fellow, and he thought he had a question that was absolutely going to floor the ex-Prime Minister and was going to absolutely destroy the guy. And he said very aggressively, XYZ. And our politician simply smiled benignly at him, and he said, well, he said, young man, you know, that's not really the question you should have asked me. You should have asked me, and then I would have said, and then he answered his own question, and the interviewer had no more play. So I will do the same thing here. I will answer these questions, hopefully not quite as our ex-Prime Minister did. So the first is about the analytics. And my understanding, but Sam Payton may like to comment on this, is that yes, the comprehensive analytics will be available soon, and we will be able to effectively assess students. I've been so pushing for that for some time. Sam, do you want to comment on that?
Hi everyone. Yep, that's correct, Tony. We are just putting the finishing touches on the first milestone, which will be hopefully available by about a week away. And there will be some kind of announcement in LT next time you log in, and you'll be prompted to try out the new analytics for yourself. This is going to be the first of 3 planned milestones for the new analytics, and it's going to really focus on building out a new dashboard that you'll be able to spot struggling students, and then drill down into the specific student and see their progress at the lesson level and at the question level as well. So it's going to be a huge improvement to what we've already got there, but of course this is just the beginning, and we'll be looking for your feedback to work out how we can improve this going forward.
Okay, thanks, Sam. And I would ask both Stephanie and Amanda there, could you just communicate directly with Sam, because that will help him as he works on this to know exactly what you would really like to find in those analytics. So thank you for those comments, Amanda and Stephanie. And please, Sam, note those and we will work with you on those. Right, Tina. I personally, if I understand your question correctly, I personally would put my these so-called lectures now online for students to do anytime they wanted to do. And if they had questions about those, I would incorporate those into that tutorial feedback time, where you really would be either face-to-face or through Zoom, be communicating with the students. So I hope that answers that question. And if I can now answer Rob, I have absolute understand that, Rob. It's exactly what I always experienced too, even in reality. One or two students tend to dominate groups unless you're very, very careful. And I would very much like to hear other people's comments on how they deal with this. Because I don't have an easy solution, and it's one that we all come across. Interesting point there, David. I've just spent a few seconds reading that. I think that you're probably right that the students who have poorer study skills will possibly benefit more. Now, it's very interesting. We've done some surveys which haven't been published yet. When I say we, our users have done these surveys and given us this information. But what they found in one study is that the very best students, the use of LT and this type of studying made no difference at all to their grades. The best students still got the same grade they always got. Also, the very poorest students didn't really improve either. And I suspect that is largely motivational issues, that the students at the bottom of the class just don't want to be there anyway, and nothing you're going to do is going to help them. But in between those groups, the vast bulk of the students improved their performance by around about 5 points in 100. So if they were getting 65% before, they were getting 70 to 74%, that sort of thing. So I think that most students have a mix of okay and poor study skills. A lot of students aren't familiar with active learning and take a while to adapt to it. But I think that overall, the students are benefiting significantly from moving to this active learning type framework. Yes, now the next question, which I see that's Dee's made this nice comment back to Rob, which I'd be very interested to hear expanded on. No doubt, Dee, you'll mention this when you talk. Now, I think the skills issue is a very interesting issue. And of course, I should have put this in, and it certainly is useful that the students learn the skills. We try, because the way the labs are described is there in the online versions, the students can still see what is meant to be done. They can see videos of what's meant to be done. They don't, of course, do it, but at least they're exposed to it. And the interesting point there about getting students to work in groups online, and this I think is going to come back and be discussed again. Right, Neil. Yes. Neil's question, which seems to have disappeared. Can you show Neil's question?
Sorry, Tony, that was probably from me. I was answering it in a chat. Neil had asked if we were expanding on the subject areas from the Understand Your series. Yep. And
the answer is yes, we are. And we're actively working on biology and chemistry at the moment. And we're looking at more material for anatomy in the future, pharmacology. I mean, there's far more to do than we can do, but I'd like to have it all done yesterday. Which is not particularly helpful, but certainly we do want to expand on this, and your ideas again and your feedback will be enormously helpful to us in doing that. Now, this is also a really interesting question from Berhan. And I think that multiple platforms are in fact distracting. And I think you should choose the best platform for the delivery at the time, but you will need more than one platform. At one stage, because we were trying to do everything, we thought, oh, within LT, we'll make a discussion board. And we looked at a lot of these things. But the fact is, you can't do everything equally well within one platform. And all you do if you try to do everything is you actually, the quality of your platform deteriorates. So yes, you know, you can do lots of things in Canvas, but how many things can you do better in Canvas than anywhere else? Zoom is really very, very good, but it isn't very good if you want students to work on questions in their own time. And so I think there is inevitably a need, as David rightly says, we do need to increase the range. We shouldn't try to force everything into one platform, but we shouldn't also have a plethora of platforms either. Because the research shows very clearly that if students become familiar with a platform, they've learned how to use it, they are far, far more effective within it than if they're constantly having to use new platforms, do things new ways. So, I seem to have answered the questions, which is very reassuring. And I hope, as I said to you at the start, I hope I wasn't like our politician. I hope that the answers actually were helpful to you. But I loved the questions, and thank you very much indeed for them.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. It's somehow miraculously really on time, which is awesome.
That's amazing, actually.
I was kind of worried that I'd have to do the awkward, oh, sorry, Tony, I just have to step in. So yeah, we'll be shifting gears soon and going into the more kind of rapid fire presentations, which will be mostly 10 minutes long. But before we do that, because we do have a bit of time, maybe if you want to stand up and have a stretch, I know I'm going to probably want to have one soon, but there's also the social session that will be immediately after the next lot of presentations, so in an hour. That's where you can actually have more in-depth conversations with other attendees and panelists that are able to join, because it'll be on a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar. So I'm just going to post in the chat to all of you the registration page if you haven't signed up already and you do want to, because it is a separate meeting, so you will have to register. So that's going to be in an hour, and hopefully, yeah, many of you can make it. So Tony, I just want to say thanks again. I was a bit worried that your kind of leaning tower of items behind you was going to fall over, so I'm glad that didn't happen.
Yes, so am I actually. It threatens to from time to time, but you know, who wants to have a tidy office?
Yeah, definitely not me.
Have a tidy mind. I don't want to have a tidy mind either.
All right, cheers, Tony. So I'll drop you back down to be a panelist, and I'll bring on the next presenter,